Shalom, friends. Welcome back to Judaism Unplugged. This video is entitled, Don't Know Much About History. I'd like to think I do know a little bit about history, but it makes for a nice title. In this video, we're going to look at some general concepts about history, how they apply to the study of Jewish history and the reality of Jewish history, and generally prepare ourselves for looking at some of the data of Jewish history in upcoming videos. So let me start here. If the calendar of a culture can be understood as how that culture views and structures the shorter time periods that make up a year, then I think history can be understood as how that culture views and structures time from year to year, with an emphasis on the lessons learned, the experiences gained, the changes made over that collection of years. The professional historians teach us many things, but I think there are three core truths that are of particular significance. First, in order to ascertain the historicity of an account or an event or a series of events, one needs to be able to compare a primary account of those events to either a corroborating outside secondary source for the same events, or to some other neutral source that provides consistent context for it, such as archaeological evidence, or art or writing that confirms elements of the story, but come from a different context. So, for example, the story of the destruction of the first temple in Jerusalem in the year 586 BCE by King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylonia, in which, in the biblical story, we have the Jewish perspective, and we have a Jewish perspective that also includes two sets of dates for the events. One according to the Jewish calendar, and one a reckoning of time in Babylonian units. There's synchronicity. There's the ability to confirm historicity. Or the story of the destruction of the city of Jericho, in which archaeology tells us that there is a significant level of great destruction. Someplace in the general area we would look to place the biblical story of the falling of the walls of Jericho, seeming to confirm that something cataclysmic happened to the city in that time period. What the historians will never be able to prove, in all likelihood, is the biblical version of exactly how those walls were brought down, with the people circling 7 times in silence and then making a huge racket on shofar and other instruments to create a massive sound vibration wave that could have led to the fall of the walls. But something clearly happened in that general period where the biblical story seems to fit in. Second, the historians teach us to fully understand the unique history of a specific people still requires us to place that people into the larger context of their time in order to avoid bias in the telling of the story. And for an example, again, we can go back to the story of the destruction of the first temple. The biblical version told from a uniquely Jewish perspective. And if that's the only version you read, or if that's the primary version you're using, one could easily get an overinflated view of Jerusalem's importance outside the Jewish community that could lead to a sense that Nebuchadnezzar had a specific problem with Jerusalem, or a specific reason or need for attacking and conquering Jerusalem itself. From the larger perspective and context of the history of the region, however, the historian recognizes the conquest of Jerusalem as a part of a larger strategy and worldview on the part of Nebuchadnezzar, Jerusalem was a necessary conquest for other ends, but not so important in and of itself. It was just one step on the way towards a desired goal, and that desired goal was Egypt. And that leads to a very different sense of the events than the one would get from reading the biblical version as their primary version, their primary text. Or a second example here, I refer back to the events around which the holiday of Hanukkah comes to be. How in the history of the holiday, Jews had come to understand the hero Judah Maccabee as being a religious zealot, and the bad guy King Antiochus as being an anti-Semite. When in the larger historical view, it's quite possible that Antiochus was not acting out of a hatred towards Jews and Judaism, or even a desire to harmonize the behaviors of everybody under his control. He may have been acting to enforce martial law to put down an uprising in a portion of his kingdom that he couldn't otherwise control. And Judah becomes the hero for being able to push back the forces sent in to control the Jews in Jerusalem, which would make him a supporter and a fighter on the side of Torah and Judaism, but doesn't automatically mean that he was all that much of a religious zealot himself. And indeed, a closer look at some of his decisions and behaviors makes it very hard to support such a decision. The third rule that we learn from the historians, as a general rule, the winners in battle get to be the ones to write the history of the battle, especially in more ancient days when wars usually ended in total conquest or annihilation, leaving no losers or no losers with the ability to write a history that anybody would take seriously. Now, there is one significant culture, one significant people that's an exception to that rule. And that people is the Jews, for reasons that I think we'll see in a couple of minutes. So, three important aspects of history in general. So if we're going to study Jewish history, then we need to start with our primary texts. And the first of those primary texts will be the Bible, and later books that come down to us, collections, very few of which were designed to be history books, but all of which contain elements of history and stories and experiences and retellings that may or may not be historical. If we can prove and confirm them through outside sources, we do much better. Second, that we need a context even beyond our Jewish context to understand Jewish history, especially for Judaism, which, as we'll see, has a history of existing as a minority culture and is therefore even more dependent upon what's going on around. And third, we need to look at whether the Jews are the winners or the losers in the history that we're writing and take that into account. Certainly, if the Jews are writing at times when we were not the winners, we're going to expect to be able to find history because we'd expect somebody who has won over the Jewish people of that period to have written their own version of history, which, by the way, doesn't make it necessarily accurate. In all of the writings of ancient Egypt, the ancient Egyptians were about 97-0 in battle. They never lost. Because when they lost, they wrote those events out of their own history. That's what the winners do when they write history. They control the narrative. So I want to take a look at a couple of things that apply uniquely to Jewish history. There's a Perspective. It's another one of those punchline perspectives that comes from a look at Jewish holidays, many of which do acknowledge points in that Jewish history. There's a running punchline that says every Jewish holiday can be understood by this simple rubric. Somebody wanted us dead. We survived. Let's eat. Applied to holidays that deal with historical events, you can see where the flow of Jewish time is going to come into this, where the flow of Jewish history is going to come into this. But second of all, going back to that idea that winners write history. If you look at all the great ancient cultures, particularly those coming out of the Middle East, how many Mesopotamians have you ever met? How many Babylonians? How many Hittites? For that matter, how many Egyptians? And Egypt is a shell of what it once was. Or even how many Ottomans? And the Ottoman Empire wasn't disbanded until the early 20th century, the end of World War I ask that question because Jewish history is far different from that of most of the great ancient civilizations, even Greece and Rome. While they both still exist, Rome is a part of Italy. Italy and Greece are part of Europe, but neither of them is considered a major player. Haven't been for years. But Jews and Judaism just keep plugging along. It's like we're the Energizer Bunny. And the interesting thing about this Energizer Bunny is that not only do we just keep plugging along, but the height of our heights never get as high as any of the other greats, but neither do the lows of our lows. And even for people who have rarely, if ever, in our history, been autonomously in control of our own destiny and our own people, and when we were, it's never lasted for a century, those lows don't go as low as the disappearance of all of these other great civilizations who impacted us, many of them, and on whom we had an impact, on many of them. So if I were to draw it as a graphic, it would probably look something like this, where you can see the varying major cultures in blue, and Judaism, the Energizer Bunny, is that sine wave looking thing in red, running through and past. In a sense, we're here still, they're not, which is one of the reasons I think that Jews get to write our own history. It's not that we've been victorious in battle, but it's that we've survived in longevity. And that gives us the ability to look back and learn a lot of lessons and share them with the world. And in order to do that, we have to share the history from our perspective. So there's that element to Jewish history. I think there's a tremendous tendency as well in talking about Jewish history to focus, as that punchline kind of does, on the negative. Because the number of times we have been in control of ourselves has been so few. Because we have been a minority people and a subject people for so much of our history. Because we have been on the receiving end of defeat in battle many, many times throughout our history, but are still here to talk about it. I think there's a perception that the vast majority of Jewish history is dark and negative and surrounds loss and defeat and being subject people. But a fair amount of our time as subjects of other rulers wasn't really spent as subject people. Sure, you can put up the the servitude in Egypt as an example of being enthralled to others. But even in the exile in Babylonia, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that even though we were taken as political prisoners in the conquest of Judea, of the southern kingdom of Judah, and the destruction of Jerusalem, that the Babylonian tradition of only taking the leaders and the educated into exile to create a controllable group led to a somewhat cushy experience of the exiles, most of whom were best suited to being tutors and household servants and slaves, which still left them a lot of freedom because they had a lot of responsibility and a lot of opportunity. It's a very different experience in Babylonia for those 50 or so years than it was in Egypt. So there's a lot of textures to Jewish history and a lot of nuance that I think is unique in the telling of Jewish history. And then there's the great questions about what that history actually looks like. And again, we go back to the historians here, because our biblical text starts with the 6 days of creation. The scientists will tell us that the acts of evolution or creation, or however you choose to see the world coming to be as humanity comes to chronicle it, took way more than a week. 6 days is a significant temporal metaphor. It's not at all historic. But again, Torah and the Bible do not start out with the intent of being historical books. They contain history in places. And so among the things we have to look at when we talk about Jewish history are what the phases are in history. Before a people's history begins, there's a fuzzy period where their culture is evolving and their ability to chronicle it is evolving. And there are stories that come from that fuzzy period. The historians call this proto-history, first history. Not quite as dependable as authentic history, but still worthy of study. And I think unique to other ancient peoples, the Jewish history also includes a significant prehistory. And what makes it unique is that while ours is probably every bit as much mythological as the Greeks or the Romans, the Babylonians or the Mesopotamians, because Judaism comes to settle on a monotheism, a belief in one and only one God, the Jewish brand of mythology, of prehistory, is not centered on God figures because they don't exist. And if they did exist in the day-to-day life of the Jewish people, those who are writing our history would have chosen to write them out anyway because of our belief eventually in one God. So our prehistory is character-driven. It's event-driven. And the characters who drive it are not gods, but humans. Humans with all of our flaws, with all of our quirks, with all of our uniqueness. The coming volumes and videos in this series are going to take significant periods in Jewish history in small little bites and present them and contextualize them. We're going to start those in a period that's clearly prehistory, where honestly we can't even put a clean date on things, but we can plug them into a general period and a general cultural context for their origins. and see the influence of other societies and how that influence would have happened. So for now, in this introduction, I'll leave you with one other conundrum, one other piece of data that we have to deal with in dealing with Jewish history. And it goes, I think, to the heart of that prehistory issue for Jews and Judaism. As I record this, Jews are celebrating and living in the year 5781 in our reckoning of time. According to tradition, that number represents the number of years since the creation of the universe. But here's the conundrum, and it comes in two parts. On the one hand, if you take the dates and the lengths of lives and the stories as presented in the biblical text and work from the story of creation up to the point where historians are comfortable putting a pretty set date on the events in the book, it's impossible to align all of that data in a way that clearly takes us to 5781. There's an internal consistency and a lot of swallowing our disbelief to get there. But there's also an external inconsistency, because the historians will tell us that we clearly have human history that is older than 5,781 years ago. And therefore, one of the questions we all need to ask of ourselves and answer for ourselves is, how do we really treat that concept that this is the year 5781? What does it really mean? What's its real significance? And again, here's a place where there are multiple possible answers, each of them equally good, each of them somewhat flawed. And so I leave it to you, the listener, you, the beginning student of Jewish history, to try and come up with an answer for yourself that makes the most sense for you and how you see the world. And with that, I'll stop for now. As always, if you have questions, you can send them to me and to us through the Temple Solel website, which hopefully is what brought you to these videos. We're happy to answer them always. Until next time, shalom, friends, and I look forward to seeing you soon.